dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Do you think that it is possible to present the summary of such great sessions in 5 minutes? Absolutely, it is impossible. So, first of all, I would like to confirm that Roland Freudenstein has been never corrupted, neither by President Putin nor by anybody else, including Poles. He was speaking about the corruptive attitude of Russian Federation, using the word us. So neither myself nor Roland Freudenstein nor many of us taking into account the role of President Putin were corrupted. I have the feeling that we all have the same impression concerning the significant changes in Europe, connected with what Carl Bildt describes as a ring of fire. I prefer the crescent of fire, because we are not surrounded by this ring. We see the threat from the east, of course, from the Russian Federation, new aggressive posture, and this is not only a phenomenon of last 2 years, but a tendency, a growing tendency during last decades. But we have also the absolutely different threat from the south. I mean, from the southern neighborhood of Europe. And when this aggressive posture, determined by illegal annexation of Crimea and showed so visibly in eastern provinces of your country, of Ukraine, this is much more conventional threat, much more traditional threat, not only hybrid threat, but conventional threat uses when President Putin used regular units in Donbass. We have the unconventional and asymmetric threat from the south, and together, I mean European and Euro-Atlantic institutions with their partners, we have to find not only the diagnosis, but also the response to those two threats. When the threat from the east is concerned, there is an agreement here. There was an agreement here during those sessions. We see the violence of post-Cold War order. Nobody was speaking about the model of cooperation between the West and Russia. I would like to add that the Russian Federation violated also the model of cooperation that was introduced into practice at the beginning of the 90s and finally introduced into the doctrine of NATO in November 2010 as cooperative model of security. It is important to remember that, because it was the model that was based on the assumption that dialogue is much more effective and will be shared by both sides than the use of military force. But these threats, I mean this one from the east and from the south, constitute an unprecedented challenge to which the democratic Europe, again, European and Euro-Atlantic institutions, together with strategic partners like Ukraine, have to find a response. I would say that nobody undermined here the response of the alliance concerning security of its member states in the aftermath of the illegal annexation of Crimea and the intervention of Russian troops in Donbass. And we have the same feeling in the eastern flank, that the NATO response concerning our security was correct. That this program of reassurance was the right one. But what about Ukraine? What about Ukraine? Many of us expressed today this assumption that the program that was proposed by NATO, also bilaterally by main member states of the alliance, was not sufficient, that it was not enough, that you expected much more, not only in political terms, but also in practical steps. Yeah? Sandy Verzbo presented today a position of NATO concerning the future. He emphasized that in the past, the alliance rejected Russian attempts to justify the illegal annexation of Crimea. Of course, yes. That there is no return to the policy of business as usual, but it would be important to define what it means. Business as usual in relationship with Russian Federation. Let's remember that this business as usual was, from time to time, very often undermined by Russian Federation when PJC or NATO-Russia Council worked. So it is necessary to define this policy of NATO not being a policy of business as usual. Sandy also underlined that NATO provided Ukraine with assistance. He spoke about sending advisors, about creating funds. Once again, was it enough? Was it enough? And let's say I am absolutely convinced that we could do more as an alliance and as main partners of Ukraine, convinced that the security of European and Euro-Atlantic community lies in the hands of independent Ukraine. The security of Europe, security of Euro-Atlantic zone depends on independence of Ukraine. Arseniy Yatsenyuk underlined that Russia understands only a language of power. This is a more or less common experience, lesson learned from the last 2 years of Russian behavior. It means that sanctions should be maintained, said Arseniy. I agree with that, so we have to be extremely careful, I would say, returning to the cooperation with Russia, even if it is restricted, even if this cooperation with Russia will be limited, for example, to the dialogue concerning Afghanistan. This is what NATO is thinking about, returning to, or the first time after 2 years, announcing the meeting of the session of the NATO-Russia Council. Extremely careful, taking into consideration that Russian aircraft take part in a political provocation against NATO on the eve of this meeting of the session of the NATO-Russia Council. This is a significant message sent to the public and to the leaders of the West just after the announcement that there will be a session of NATO-Russia Council. Russia has a Putin's doctrine in which the use of force is one of the tools to protect Russian-speaking minorities. You know that very well, especially here in Ukraine. It means to protect Russian interests in the post-Soviet region. But there has been also a militarization of Russian foreign policy, and that's visible in such regions like Middle East. The involvement of Russian troops in the operation in Syria is one of the results of this process of militarization of Russian foreign policy that we observe for years. And the third factor that has to be taken into consideration, this is the influence and the role in the domestic political decision-making of the complex, the security complex and its agents. Long-term challenge for the West and a direct threat for Ukraine, unfortunately, without doubts. And it was not so deeply discussed during the sessions, but let me share with you my opinion concerning three major points that should be introduced into the agenda of the Warsaw Summit. There will be not only a summary of everything that was introduced concerning Readiness Action Plan during the last 2 years after the Newport Summit, but there will be a new perspective presented by the Warsaw Summit in July this year. So what should be the main elements, factors of this position of NATO? First of all, deployment of at least, I say at least, because we believe that there will be a permanent deployment of NATO troops in the eastern flank of NATO, but there will be a temporary and rotational deployment of those troops. So at least deployment of significant rotational and persistent NATO troops, not only American troops on the eastern flank. Secondly, efforts to achieve a high degree of interoperability between European American forces from NATO and forces of your country, Ukrainian forces. It can be achieved only not through advising, but through exercises. So it means that the size of exercises, the participation of as many countries as possible from the Euro-Atlantic community, together with Ukrainian forces, will determine interoperability of our joint military forces. Thirdly, NATO should offer Ukraine broader assistance. I'm absolutely convinced that financial support and advisory missions, this is not enough, that the trust should be reinforced, that financial assistance should be enhanced, and there should be also the assistance in kind when it is possible and when it is requested by the Ukrainian side. But also, there should be also the deepened cooperation on the strategic and operational level, because Ukrainian forces will be absolutely ready to reach the goals on the tactical level, if there is a good cooperation on both strategic and operational levels. Thank you so much.
Bogdan.